We are in the midst of one of liberal democracy's great civic rituals, the biennial elections. Their stakes seem to be much higher this year than is often the case. And in the past weeks, I've talked to more than a few of you who've reported losing sleep over their potential outcomes. Pundits, politicians, scholars, and a great number of other people share a perspective somewhat similar to the journalist Liza Featherstone. She's written recently, "We're potentially facing a political disaster with implications even worse than 2016. The journalist and statistician Nate Silver has sometimes described politics as sports with consequences. And while the Astros had an exciting victory, let's hear it again for the World Series champs. There's a good chance that the teams that many Unitarian Universalists support in the events on Tuesday are not going to do so well. This morning, I want to offer you a set of spiritual practices that might help you find a little hope if your team loses and the times ahead prove to be even more difficult. They are: connect yourself to the ground of being, use your imagination, and commit to a community. The ground of being. I wonder if that phrase is familiar. Historically, many people within our theological tradition have found it a more comfortable one to use than the word God. Our use of it is one of the reasons why Unitarian Universalism is a pluralistic community. In congregations like ours, we welcome a diversity of theological perspectives. Some of you are atheists, or theists, or humanists, or neo-pagans, or... The Unitarian Universalist theologian Tandeica is familiar to some of you. She visited this congregation about a decade back to speak with you about reconnecting to the ground of being. In her sermons for religious communities like this one, she likes to tell a story about the artist and composer John Cage. You might recognize his name. He pushed the musical boundaries of the 20th century with pieces like 4 minutes and 33 seconds. It can be performed by one musician or many. During its course, performers are instructed not to play a single note on their instruments. Some people think of the composition as 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, but that was not what Cage hoped audiences would get out of it. Instead, he wanted listeners to attune themselves to the ambient sounds around and reconsider the exact nature of music. Was it only found in the pluck of a string or the plunk of a key? Or was it the heart's beat, the passing train, the bird's call? Maybe music is all around us. We just have to learn to listen differently. A few years before he composed the piece, Cage went into what's called an anechoic chamber. This is a small, six-sided, specially constructed room designed to be, in his words, as soundproof and reverberation-free as technologically possible. Inside of it, he anticipated hearing absolute silence, but he did not. Instead, he heard two sounds. The first was a high-pitched whine, the sound of his nervous system. The second, a low throb, the sound of blood circulating through the body. Hearing these sounds, he realized that there is no such thing as pure silence. The sound of life itself, the sound of living bodies, is there for those of us who can hear it. The experience caused him to realize that he was connected to and part of the universe at all times. He was a sound-making being filled in a world of sound. He wrote that his time in the chamber prompted him to recognize the world of nature, where gradually or suddenly one sees that humanity and nature not separate, are in this world together. That nothing was lost, and that, in fact, everything was given away, everything was gained. The words might be a little challenging to parse. What Cage was trying to describe is something that Kandeka calls the cosmic consciousness. This is the feeling of awareness of life itself. When we become aware that we are part and parcel of all that is. It is in the moments we experience connection with life without end, joy without remorse, and an unbounded love that comes from the all of life. This experience of connection is available to us at all times. Sometimes it can be found when we sit in the quiet. Other times it's found in the noise we make together. So could we have just a collective moment of noise, maybe clap or stomp or... We are sound-making beings awash in a universe of sound. Tandeka has described the experience of connection that is found in such moments as an experience of absolute dependence. We are dependent upon life itself for our lives. This feeling of absolute dependence, this connection to the ground of being, is something that Unitarian Universalists understand is available to all of humanity. Our path to theological pluralism comes from the recognition, in Tandeka's words, that all religious talk refers to this feeling of absolute dependence. Christians might use the words God, Buddhists Sunyata, pagans Gaia, humanists the universe. The words used are not important. What is important is that we all know that we all share this common connection, or better, that we are this common connection. No matter which team you're rooting for on Tuesday, no matter which team wins, and no matter what happens, we can always connect to the ground of being. There are many ways you might do so. You could sit in the stillness and try to hear the sound you bring into the world. Or you could go out and touch a tree. Take off your shoes and socks and ground yourself on the ground itself. Whatever you do, I suspect that it will make you feel better. It will remind you that we are all connected, that we are each members of the great family of all souls, siblings born of the same long-dead star, living, walking, breathing star stuff. Our theme in worship this month, incidentally, is soil. We're continuing along with our annual theme of roots and branches by considering precisely what it is that the roots sink themselves into. So today, on this Sunday before the election, we're talking in part about reconnecting to the ground of being as a way to get through hard times. Reconnecting to the ground of being is the first spiritual practice I recommend. The second is opening yourself to the radical imagination. The radical imagination brings what William Morris called the news from nowhere. This is our vision of a better world. We all have one. They might be very simple: a place to live, clean water, clean air, good food, a little bit more beauty, a community of friends, and some work to call honest. Or they might be far more detailed: community gardens, trains instead of automobiles, art everywhere. Let me pause here and invite you to imagine for a moment or two. Close your eyes and get comfortable. If the better world, the great turning we sang of earlier, came into being, what came into being right now, what would it look like? If after this service you were to leave the sanctuary and find that it had come, what would you discover as you moved along the street? Would there even be a street? what would you see throughout the city of Houston? Would homes look the same? The buildings? If you're working or looking for work, what would your work life be like? Would you have the same kind of job? Would you be doing it in the same way that you're doing it now? Open your eyes again. After the service, I encourage you to share something of your vision with other members of this community, with people you live with or near, or with, well, really anyone you think might listen. Sharing such visions is one way we start to bring them into being. Whatever the outcome of the election, it will be important to remind ourselves that we have the ability to bring the news from nowhere, and that we can always put ourselves in touch with the radical imagination. The imagination is the thing that allows us to build bridges, craft temples, create farms, and shape wood into tables. The poet Philip Levine admits that the imagination can sometimes bring about unpleasant things, create unsettling visions, but nonetheless urges us, let's bless the imagination. It gives us the myths we live by. Let's bless the visionary power of the human, the only animal that's got it. One of the unfortunate consequences of living in a liberal democracy is that it tends to limit people's political imaginations. We focus on elections. Elections have consequences. And I've not said this yet, but if you've not already voted, please vote on Tuesday. If you need help getting to the polls, let me or somebody else on the staff know, and we can connect you with a volunteer who will give you a ride. But elections are only a form of politics. They're not all politics. The political is how we human beings choose to arrange our communities. We're engaged in politics anytime people come together to do something. And when we face injustice or when we want to do something to bring the news from nowhere, we do not need to wait for elections. We do not have to limit ourselves to their outcomes either. As some of you might remember, I spent many years involved in labor organizing. And it's one of the common misconceptions in both U.S. labor unions and amongst employers that unions require contracts if they're going to improve the lives of working people. The myth is that to start a union, you have to win a union election at your workplace. And only after that, you've gotten that recognition, then you can negotiate with your employer. This myth sets up a dynamic where employers try at all costs to prevent unions from building and from holding successful elections. If you've been following the news about Starbucks or Chipotle, you probably have some sense of the depths to which large corporations will sink. Intimidation, illegal firings, and unlawful store closures are all part of the playbook. One of the things that I would do with people when I was organizing with them was to try to get them to think about unions and politics differently. You do not need to have a contract to be a union, I would tell them. A union is simply two or more workers cooperating together to improve their working conditions. And this is true in both law and actual fact. I imagine that most of you are not familiar with the 1953 National Labor Relations Act. And I bet you didn't think you were coming to church today to hear a little bit about labor law. But this is the piece of legislation that established the legal framework for forming unions. In Section 7, the Act clearly provides full protections of U.S. labor law to any group of two or more people who engage in concerted activities for the purposes of collective bargaining or mutual aid or protection. The point of this particular piece of legislation, I would tell people, I was trying to help build a union, is that you are the union. If you get together with your coworkers and cooperate to create a better workplace, you become the union. You don't have to wait for a successful election or the completion of contract negotiations, you can act now. And for years, I would collect stories of people doing just that. They were instances of people imagining a better life for themselves and then doing a little to bring that better life into being, to create a better workplace. A lot of the actions that people took were very simple. One person who worked at a pizza restaurant told me about how he and some of his fellow workers dealt with the poor safety conditions on their job. Oven gloves were a constant issue. Management refused to replace them until they were literally falling apart. And so most of the gloves were filled with holes and were not much help when taking hot pizzas out of the oven. The workers were getting burned all the time. The worker I talked with told me that he and his friends had come up with a game to fix this. They called it binning gloves. At the end of every shift, they would check the gloves. If they were subpar by their standards, they would toss them into the bin behind the store. Their manager would try to stop them and insist that they continue to use the unsafe gloves. But the problem is it's really hard to monitor who is putting what in the trash all the time and then taking it out to the curb. And so after the end of a few shifts, all of the bad gloves were gone. And this actually meant that there were no gloves left. And the managers didn't know who had binned them. And so in order to keep the restaurant open, they had to rush out right then and there and buy a whole bunch of new oven gloves. And the tactic worked. And after that, they always had adequate gloves at work. And nobody got that burned, or people stopped getting burned so much. This is just one example of being the union. I've got dozens of others I could share with you. However, what I hope you get from the story is this. The workers did not wait for an election or a union contract to address their problems. They found creative solutions they could implement on their own. I want to invite you to think back to your vision from earlier, your news from nowhere. I would like you to ask yourself a question. Is there some small action I can take, or take with a couple of people that I know to help bring it into being? You do not necessarily have to make a grand gesture. It might be something as simple as binning gloves. There are many actions that we can take to build a better world, and so many of them fall outside of the realm of electoral politics. How might you think creatively about building collective power? Collective power. This brings me to my third spiritual practice. Do not go it alone. Join a group of others. I happen to think that if you're not already a member, one of the best ways you can do this is, of course, joining a Unitarian Universalist congregation. As an institution, we can come together and accomplish things that we cannot as individuals. Last Sunday, some 20 of us left here after the second service to go knock doors in Precinct 20. Together, we visited several hundred households and talked with dozens of people about early voting. And this was far more than any of us could accomplish on our own. I'm almost certain that it made a difference in getting some people out to the polls. But even if it didn't, it was excellent practice on how we can cooperate together. Let me linger here for just a moment longer. I want to share with you a statement that one of the members of this congregation made to me a couple of years ago during an annual stewardship campaign. Unfortunately, I can't remember exactly who said this, so if this is your story, please come talk to me after the service. But in our conversation, I asked them why they'd been part of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for so many years. They replied with a statement that went something like this. When I was in my 20s, I thought I would help save the world. When I was in my 30s and 40s, I thought I could make a difference in the United States. In my 50s, I thought I could have an impact on the state of Texas and the city of Houston. When I reached my 60s, I realized that I was not going to be able to do any of those things necessarily. But what I could do was help sustain this institution, meaning our congregation, and that it could play a role in all of those things. And then the member rattled off a short list of the accomplishments of First Unitarian Universalist and the Unitarian Universalist Association over the last decades. Being part of an institution like this, cultivating the radical imagination and then acting from it, and connecting with the ground of being. These are all spiritual practices that we can engage in no matter the outcomes of Tuesday's election. They can sustain us for the course. Our institutions like this congregation can help us remember that we are not alone and we can organize together. Our imaginations can help empower us to bring the news from nowhere. There are always small things we can do to make that news, that vision, a reality. And the ground of being, the ground that is under our feet and beneath us at all times can remind us and help us experience that great truth, that we are never really alone, that no matter how hard it gets, we are all each a member of the great family of all souls, caught up in the love of all life, each contributing our sounds, our being to the sounds of all. May we always remember this, and in our remembrances, may we find the sustenance we need in all the days of our lives, be they easy or hard. That it might be so, I invite the congregation to say, Amen.
Amen.